I'm learning a lot about myself lately regarding being back home and what bothers me and what doesn't. And it seems like something that really bothers me is TV noise and iPad noise. And there weren't any TVs around when I was in California, so I didn't really notice that it was bothersome because it wasn't around. But now that it's around, it's really bothering me. And so I feel like people are trying to be more quiet and not have the TV on. And so the TV sound was off last night and I felt fine and I was just working away and I got a lot done. I was reading through some of my notes and typing them up, and I was also downloading some of the YouTube videos as audio to make the audio video playlist with YouTube MP3 program and also Tunes to Tube web-based browser thingamajiggy. So I did that for the last month of videos. And yeah, I was doing a bunch of things at once and I felt totally fine. But if I'm sitting in my room and the TV's on, I just can't even do anything. It feels like I can't even move. So I'm learning that. And then I had an experience with the Muse headset that sort of confirms that. I did a meditation and I realized that I think the sounds of the Muse app are quite distracting for me. So I tried using the Muse headband as well as the app, but I just turned the volume all the way down, so I couldn't really hear anything. And I actually earned a lot more birds and had way less recoveries because I had way less times going into an active brain state. And I can't even remember the numbers right now, but I will check. I had 35 birds and 10 recoveries last night in 10 minutes, and I think I had something like 58% calm time, whereas before I was around 48 or something. So yeah, not listening to the sounds made it a lot easier to stay calm and not have the sound of the bird be distracting. And I don't know if I'm supposed to get to a point where I'm not distracted by the sound of the birds, but I feel it's better just to use the headset and not have those bird sounds. And so I passed level 6, which was to have 4 sessions in 2 days. And level 7's challenge is to get 2,000 points. So, before that, I did another meditation this morning to get the 4 times in 2 days thing. And I got 37 birds and 12 recoveries or something. And I also didn't have the volume going for that. So it seems like it's better just to stay calm and not have the sounds. But that sort of gets rid of the biofeedback aspect of it. But I feel like the biofeedback is what is distracting. And maybe one cannot be so distracted by that and can stay focused on breathing, but I'm not sure. So then this morning I went to the park and I thought for my level 7 challenge I'm supposed to get 2,000 calm points. So I figured if I do 17 minutes at the park I should probably be able to get that. But it didn't turn out that way. I didn't get that many points. I think I got around 1,500, and I had more time in the neutral zone and quite a few more recoveries and not as many birds. So The park was actually a little distracting because it was windy. So there was the rustling of the leaves of the tree, and there were a couple of people that walked by, and there were actual birds chirping. So I was thinking how it's interesting that one can be distracted by actual birds. And I don't think it's really distraction, because one can be distracted by a stimulus like a TV, or one can be so-called distracted by a bird. I don't think that that's really a distraction. If I'm sitting there breathing quietly and I hear a bird, I think I want to hear the actual bird in reality, but I don't actually want to hear a TV going. So I became aware of the difference between a sound that's distracting, like even the sounds of the Muse app with the fake bird, or a real bird at the park. And I think I want to hear the real bird at the park. So that was actually interesting to note, that a lot of times moving through the world, we are bombarded by stimuli that we would want to tune out and maybe stay connected to our breathing and our body, but we don't want to be like that all the time. And I feel like if the world was more designed for highly sensitive people and not so much noise, and there were more trees and nature and birds around, I don't think it would really be a problem as much to be distracted. I don't even think it would be distraction. When I was in California, it was just nature and beauty, and I didn't have to worry about being distracted by nature. So distraction is, in my mind, a false construct. But I'm noticing, being back, that there are things that really do bother me. And I noticed last night as I was falling asleep that my boobs were hurting again. So I feel like I'm getting this like 2-week long PMS. And that could be contributing too. I feel like the Hardy Nutritionals are working right now to heal some of my hormone stuff. That's just an intuition. I don't know if it's true. But it feels like I spend half the month in a more emotional and sensitive state than the other half. And that vacillates day by day and varies day by day as well. But I'm just noticing that the signs of PMS are there sort of halfway through the month. Tonight, I'm going to go for the 2,000 calm points on Muse. I don't know if it's actually helping. I'm still just going along with it, and I'm not really trying to do it to get help. I just find it fascinating. And it is facilitating some form of learning, because seeing that the sounds of the app are distracting, and then sound in general is something that will make the brain active. And there's certain sounds that are fine, like the rustling of the leaves in a park, and there are other sounds like the murmuring of the TV through the wall that I just can't deal with. It messes up my brain. It really feels like it does, at least. And the Muse app and Muse headband helped me discover that to some extent. So that is cool. And I've been working on some of the ideas for the business, as well as some of the extrapolations from the cool things that I've read lately. And I do want to get into those before I get into anything that I've extrapolated. And I was typing up my notes, and I got through quite a bit. And there was some seemingly interesting stuff there that maybe I'll want to get to at some point. But I feel like I'm going to extrapolate some of these things I read, and then probably not really worry about getting into the stuff that I'm typing up, and just continue to type some of it up. First, I want to talk about some stuff that I read on bolotto.com/about. So it's Bo Lotto, the neuroscientist's about page. And he has a section that you can click on titled Labs or Workshops. And what he describes is really fascinating, because, well, it just is. He says, for example, that experience, both personal and shared, shapes your brain, literally. So I extrapolate that to an experience in so-called mania, or map consciousness or trance consciousness shapes the brain. It can't do but otherwise. And this whole dialogue with myself this past year, I've been interested in how it shapes the brain. And in a way, that first experience in map consciousness 6 years ago is what is shaping this very conversation with myself. It's the reason why I'm having this conversation with myself. So it's literally changed my whole life and created this unfolding of dialogue and context creation with myself that I wouldn't have otherwise had fuel to do. And he says, since the structure of your brain determines what you see, it's never possible to see the information in front of you directly, which has no inherent meaning anyway. So we never see what information is directly in front of us. And he goes on to say that you only ever see the past behavioral significance or meaning of that information. So he's saying we see the meaning of the information in front of us. So to me, map consciousness changes the meaning of what we see in front of us, because it's no longer only information from past behavioral significance, but there's some other energy adding new significance into the information and presenting it to us as our perception. And having an experience in map consciousness also changes the brain in ways that will make seeing in these new ways possible again. So he says, in other words, we only see what was useful to see before. And he goes on to say, but if what I see now is a response grounded in the past, how can I ever see differently in the future? So that's a very complicated question. And it's complicated in terms of extrapolating it to my own personal context. And that's what I want to do, is adapt what he's saying to my own personal context. And he says this himself later on in his blurb under the lab section. He says, my aim is to transform our understanding of change through discovery. It's only through discovery that we embody the understanding that leads to resilience, i.e., the ability to share and adapt knowledge to your own social and personal context. And to me, that's just brilliant, because that's what my conversation with myself has been all about this past year, is taking my experience and knowledge and information and meaning making and everything and adapting it to my own personal context. And that's what I'll continue to do. And what I've found through time is that by this process of self-discovery, which he just said, it's only through discovery that we embody the understanding that leads to resilience. So this process of self-dialogue for me has been about my own discoveries, and I've talked about this whole time in that way, discovering for myself, and then here, a year later, I find somebody who's a neuroscientist who's saying that this is actually neurophysiologically and neuroplastically coherent. And what I'm also finding is through my own discoveries, when I figure something out or I discover something for myself through self-dialogue, then when I go look around in reality, in actuality, it then confirms my discovery. So it's a reversal of the process of discovery from what we usually think in terms of what learning is. And we usually feel like by looking outward we'll find the answers, but it happens differently when we start discovering by unfolding meaning and context for ourselves. Then when we go to reach out to reality, we find in reality what we've discovered. And this is how it already works in a way. It's the ego with its ruminating loops going on repeat, and then that confirms that reality is the way it is because it's repeating, and that creates perception and joins with the information that we're perceiving to confirm that the world is the way that the ego voice is telling us it is. But when we go into that state of wonder and discovery, and we really don't know how it is, then when we do discover something and then we look out, we'll find something that confirms that that is true for the moment, at least. It's not necessarily absolutely true, but it's how the universe responds to our discoveries by then presenting that as possible. So a discovery is, this is a possibility, and then it's there in actuality. So I would extend what he's talking about, because he's saying it's this process of discovery that we embody, because he's saying that through this process of discovery we embody the understanding and it leads to resilience, but I would say it also leads to manifestation and creation of our life in actuality. To say that discovery, which is something beyond the personal self, we have to see beyond what the ego is telling us to discover something new. So it's something beyond our self-construct. So then to say that just builds resilience, which is something attributed to the self, is limited in my mind, because it actually builds the ability to discover what we discovered in the unfolding of our life. Because the ego is that which would cover up what might unfold in our life if we might discover something new. So I don't know if that makes any sense, and that was kind of jumping ahead, but I just wanted to bring that in because I'm reading some of what he has written and then adapting it to my own personal context. And I've already discovered these points for myself, and I'm just pointing it out that I've been yabbing to myself for a year and discovering these certain aspects of life or being or whatever the heck. And then here is a neuroscientist saying the exact same thing that he has probably discovered through his science process. I've discovered it through my Gaians process, the Gaiantist in me, in investigating my being's relationship to daily life through my experience. And now it seems I'm at the point where I'm trying to reach out and figure out these things in daily life through lifestyle design. So how do I design a life of discovery and not have a life of self-protection or creating resilience out of discovery? And resilience is part of it, but resilience for what? To continue to discover, to continue to manifest, to continue to create, to continue to unfold. And then he goes on to talk about how we're really afraid of uncertainty. And if anyone has gone into so-called mania or map consciousness, then you would have that sense that in that state, we're not afraid of uncertainty at all. We're moving in the field of uncertainty, and that's why it's so creative. And he's saying that we need to start with not knowing and uncertainty in order to be creative. I think I heard that from one of his talks, so I won't go into that now, and he says, thus certainty is a deep survival need, and uncertainty the cause of most contemporary social and emotional pathologies, which means the next greatest innovation is not going to be an external technology, but an internal way of seeing and doing. In short, fear, not efficiency, is the biggest barrier to success. And I shared that quote in a previous video because it's so important. And I wonder, from what he said there, is there a way to live in uncertainty? And I would say that's living in that state of mania. And I'm not trying to glorify it or say it's the be-all end-all. What I'm saying is, can we extract and extrapolate some of those qualities and turn those qualities of that state into a kind of skill? Can we be skillful? And it's important to balance taking care of the body with that creative energy. And he says, changes that leads to innovation, leadership, and learning all require letting go of certainty. So it's interesting. He's saying let go of certainty, yet those of us who've been in mania know that it's a lot to do with letting go of certainty. And it's not that we choose to let go of certainty. Certainty lets go of us. And so here's another case of somebody who is creating research from the perspective of there's something that needs to let go, or there's something that we can volitionally do, and all of our volition is from certainty. It's from a place of knowing, and any act we do from that place will only move us in the field of the known, because it's a projection from the past. So how can a projection from the past move into uncertainty? So what I'm saying is there's a whole neurotribe of people that go into certainty because that certainty lets go of us, not that we let go of it. And I'm wondering if we can let go of it. And maybe we can, but I'm curious about the tribe of people who don't try to let go of anything and are thrust into uncertainty. So it's the same theme where there are those who are trying to get into flow, trying to get into these other states, and then there's people who go into the states without this volitional act, and then as soon as it happens without a volitional act, or a supposed volitional act, and it happens in a megadose through non-volition versus a microdose versus some kind of contrived pattern of volition, then it's a pathology. So I don't know about that, and that's why I'm taking this other perspective of knowing that I've gone into these non-volitional uncertain states and wondering what I can harvest and put into my daily life to embody that, because I've had an immersive experience in this uncertainty. And he did say in one of his videos that the brain only moves in short jumps, and I don't know if that's true. And he said that even when someone appears to make a big jump, it's only from the outside perspective, because internally it's the next logical step for that person that appears to be being so creative. So I feel like in him saying that the algorithm of map consciousness is creativity that makes the next logical step a creative step, as opposed to a very limited step that the ego might take. So it changes the algorithm to make far-reaching ideas seem obviously linked. So yeah, continuing to do what he's saying to do in his little blurb here, and moving this information and making it meaningful in terms of my own personal context. And he says, thus, understanding the relationship between uncertainty, experience, and brain plasticity in creating perception is essential to understanding the principles of behavioral change and why change is so difficult. So here he's saying something about the necessity of behavioral change, or why it's difficult to change. Yet again, if somebody has a huge behavioral change because they've gone into a map conscious state, then everyone's concerned. So it's okay to have these little 30-day challenges where you have one little behavior change, but if there's a radical mutation in the mind where someone is all of a sudden radically different in behavior, then everyone is wondering, what's wrong with that person? What's wrong with that ego? What's wrong with that self? And something I want to talk about next is an article about how there is no self. It's a model of the world. So an algorithm changes to change how we model the world, and then our behavior changes accordingly. And he says here, understanding the relationship between uncertainty, experience, and brain plasticity in creating perception is essential to understanding the principles of behavioral change. Well, there's principles of the manic algorithm. And the manic algorithm is all about being in uncertainty, It's about not even taking the law of gravity and the laws of physics for granted. It's really starting from scratch and moving in that field of uncertainty. And in that way, all the knowledge we've accumulated and identified with and attached to ourself as what we know as an ego self, storing up that information in memory to use for later. And that's what we use to create our perception. He says creating perception. So usually we have the past knowledge coming in to create perception. But when we're in this field of uncertainty, we don't have all that past knowledge to come in to create perception. So something else, some other energy infuses the information with different meaning. So the smallest perception can feel very meaningful because there's a brand new, fresh meaning. And this is important because each moment we're creating our perception, and we're probably most likely creating it with our ego knowledge. So nothing seems fresh and new. And the ego knowledge that would be infused into the moment is old. And if that process ceases, then each moment we have access to infinite possibilities of what to even look at, let alone the meaning that can be infused to what we end up looking at in that moment. So all of a sudden we're in this field of something totally rich and new, because every single thing that we look at and explore is infused with a creative energy that is presenting us with all this meaning. So we're away from this meaningless knowledge structure of something very limited into unlimited possibilities. And today when I was walking, I kind of realized that. This whole year, I've been playing with perception, playing with creating perception. I've had insights where I see something, and when I see and I look, the knowledge of myself or my brain accumulation doesn't come in, but something else whispers a different possible meaning. And I write it down, and that's an insight. And it's not about right and wrong, which can only come into play if we're comparing to our past knowledge. So if we're not comparing to our past knowledge, which is an accumulation of right and wrong, good and bad, reward and punishment, pleasure, pain, then we're listening to this voice of insight, and then we can write them down or speak as that, instead of speaking as the knowledge of the ego that it would infuse into the moment and just make us continually live out past perceptions. We're creating old perceptions over and over. So the relationship between uncertainty, experience, and brain plasticity. So map consciousness is an experience of uncertainty, hence brain plasticity. Those are all tied together, and that's part of learning. So learning something new every moment. And we don't even know what that thing will be because it's so infinite. It's not a thing. It's sensing the meaning of something by just looking at it. So this, what he's talking about, applies to all of what I've talked about with myself regarding learning. So can we let the moment talk to us? Can we let the moment of what we look at arise spontaneously with a new infusion of meaning, as opposed to the known coming in and saying that it's already seen that before. In each moment, there's infinite bits of what we've never seen before, and there's a very small amount of what we have already seen before. But when we're always bringing in our knowledge bank, we're moving in a very limited field of creating perception. So I wonder if we can design certainty in the areas that are necessary and then move in that field of uncertainty. So it's no wonder that when we're in this uncertain field, experiencing all this neuroplasticity, that our behaviors change so much. So to me, this sounds like epigenetics at the level of the brain cells, at the level of the moment. And Bo says, without this awareness, the ability to innovate, lead, and learn will be limited, since at the core of these most essential and creative human behaviors is the ability to see differently, to live with intention. So it's interesting that he says the most essential creative human behavior is the ability to see differently. And when we go into map consciousness, we see everything differently. We see everything new. We see things different than other people do. We see more than other people do. We say what we see. And we're trying to share that perception. We're trying to share that creative perception. So we have a creative perception, we share it, and it's met with people not necessarily seeing what we're saying because they're translating it according to their past memory bank. So something that is actually important is to realize that that's what other people are doing. Because one of the downfalls is, in a way, when that happens and we're in that creative perceptual state, we feel like everyone else is there too, but they're not per se. So we need to be careful how we share those creative perceptions. So we need to be aware what universe we're in and what universe other people are in. And just because we're in a different realm, in a way, in a different dimension of perception, which unfolds different behaviors and etc., other people aren't necessarily there too. But we may be able to share a little bit. And this is our main capacity, is our ability to see differently, take different perspectives, see something different in the same moment. So walking down a trail, we might spot something really fascinating that other people might walk by. Not all the time, but that creative perceptual state increases the possibility that we're going to see new things, because it's an algorithm that is designed for us to see new moment to moment. And that does change behavior. So we epigesture ourselves further and further away from the reality where people are in the knowledge domain of repetition. For me, perception becomes an unlimited creative act. So the creative act is at the level of perception, not necessarily trying to create something in actuality so much. We think of creativity as painting or something, but it's a creative perception that is real creativity, because once we have that creative perception in the moment, that will change our field of possibilities for further creative perceptions. And there's another article I want to talk about that talks about the salience network. So having a new creative perception increases the salience of seeing the next logical step of that creative perception. Maybe not the next moment, but when it's around in actuality, it gives us the possibility of the next creative perception, which presents a discovery to our awareness. And then we can make our own discoveries with our own eyes. And that's why I've talked about the process of being a scientist as opposed to a scientist. Just looking at something and being able to understand it and discover that for oneself. And not necessarily thinking, I'm going to spend the next 20 years becoming a scientist so I can isolate this one variable to learn this one thing that I could learn in 1 second by looking. And of course we need science for certain things, for sure, but a lot of it we can discover for ourselves with our own eyes, and then have the field of science where it's absolutely necessary. So our ability to see differently is our most valuable asset. Yet at the same time, this is what we're punished for the most. Because if we start talking about what we're seeing differently, people, and they don't see it that way. They don't see creatively. They see according to their knowledge. And then if we're speaking as our creative perception, as that voice, and no longer speaking as The ego infusing past knowledge into the information of every moment and speaking as the ego self that everyone knows us as, then people are wondering what is wrong with us, when really something has shifted to become right with us. Creative perception can right a lot of the ego structures, but from the limited perspective of the ego, it seems threatening, and it seems like something's wrong with the person who's having creative perceptions. And I'm not saying that it never goes awry. It does, for sure. And I'm not here to talk about that as much because there's a million campaigns out there and so much information on that aspect. I'm here to talk about the other side of it and move into that, because there's so much talk about all the downsides, and 99% of people, or I don't know what percentage of people, are living mostly in the downside, because that's what we're discovering, and that's what we're focusing on, that's what we're talking about. And then that's how people who get labeled start to think about themselves and frame themselves, and that's the knowledge that they infuse into their perception. So if they have a creative perception, then all of a sudden the knowledge comes in and says, oh my gosh, that means something's wrong with me. That means, and so we never learn about what this process is doing. So there's another energy that infuses meaning into perception, infuses meaning into the information of the moment. And that is a different language altogether. And that's why I've talked with myself so much, because I feel like even the process of self-dialogue is a different language. Even if I was using all the same language, it's still a different language. It's a different approach to communication. And language is a part of communication, but it's not all of it. Yet communication itself is a language. So there's body language, there's word language, but self-dialogue is a type of language of self-discovery. So it's more fundamental in a way. It uses the word language, it uses body language, but it's something more fundamental. Part of why I talk so much to myself is so maybe one day people won't be punished for seeing differently. Because here is Bo Lotto, an obvious genius neuroscientist doing all these great things and saying seeing differently is so important, yet don't see too differently. He doesn't say that part, but people like me who have been labeled and pathologized and medicated and numbed out and put through this rigmarole to get back into an ego self of certainty know that seeing differently is dangerous. More so because of the fallout of it all than actually the process of seeing differently. So how can we see differently and avoid the fallout? And part of that, I feel, is getting together and creating context together and learning this language together of seeing differently, and then not being pathologized for it. And part of that is seeing what seeing differently can do when it doesn't result in the fallout. And part of one of the downfalls is that we accidentally utilize the seeing differently to fuel more energy into the self, the ego. And then when that comes back online, it really does with a vengeance.